Hello! Welcome to my tutorial for beginners on how to work with and create your own jump rings. Now I have on the mat in front of me 3 different sizes of jump rings. You'll find that they come in different diameters and different gauges. So here's a small one that's made with a thinner gauge, and here's a larger jump ring that's made with a thicker gauge. The thicker the gauge that these jump rings are made with, the stronger that they're going to be. So when I work with a large jump ring, I like to work with as thick of a gauge of wire as will fit. So to open and close a jump ring, you're going to need 2 pliers, 1 in each hand. Now I have in my left hand a square nose plier, also known as a flat nose, and in this hand I have a chain nose plier. Now you could have a pair of each instead of one or the other. I happen to have one of each handy, so I'm going to use these. So the most important thing is that the insides of your pliers are flat and smooth. Okay. So to open my jump ring, I'm going to grasp it flat across the sides on either side of my opening. My opening is right up there. And I'm just going to do a slight twist of my hands to swing the jump ring out to the side. Okay. I could go either direction. I could also go this direction. Now it's sometimes a good idea actually to see how I'm opening and closing this a couple of times. That is work hardening my jump ring. If the metal is soft, opening and closing it a couple of times will help to strengthen your ring. Once your jump ring is open, you can use it to hook different items together. For instance, a clasp. This jump ring is just a little big for using with this clasp, but it will help you see what I'm doing. And here's a piece of chain. To close your jump ring, you'll grab it the same way that you're grabbing it before and just reverse the motion that you had done to open it to bring it closed. And make sure you've brought both ends tightly together. There you go. So what I'd like to show you next is the improper way to open and close a jump ring, because I see people do this all the time and it can ruin your jump ring and or make it more difficult to close up. So please, please do not do this to open your jump ring. Notice I am grabbing it the same way I was grabbing it before, but do not stretch your jump ring out like this to open it. It will lose its shape and it will lose its strength. Alright, now it's time to make your own jump rings. As a beginner, there's a couple of different ways you can make jump rings for your jewelry designs with just some very simple tools. I'm going to show you first with this tool here. It's called the Easy Jump Ring Maker. It's also available on my Etsy store. You can find the link in the description of the video. So this comes with a finger plate and 4 different mandrels. The mandrels will be what you size your jump rings around. So I'm going to pick a mandrel and I'm going to screw it into my finger plate. There we go. Okay. Now I like to use a pretty thick gauge wire for my jump rings so that they're strong enough. So what I'm going to use right now is going to be an 18 gauge wire. See this little hole right here? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the wire through that hole. Just fold it on the other side there to secure it right there. Now I'm going to loosely hold the mandrel and the wire. I'm going to use my thumb to guide the wire as I spin the finger plate with my other hand. Bringing the wire in tight against the mandrel to create a coil. Now I want my rings relatively close, but it's okay to leave a slight gap, not too big, in between them. So you'd keep going until you have as many rings as you want. I'm going to stop here. Going to just cut my wire off the bundle that I was working from. I'm going to release the end from the finger plate. Now if I was working with a precious metal, this would be a lot of waste to cut off, so I would probably work it against the mandrel to get more rings out of it, but I'm not going to worry about this wire. Okay, so here's my coil. To cut a jump ring with a handheld cutter, this is a flush cutter, I'm going to make sure I know which side is the flush side, that's the side that's flat, and the side that's not flush, it has a bevel to it. Every jump ring that I cut is going to require 2 cuts, and you can only cut 1 ring at a time. To begin, I'm going to first cut my scrap off. I'm going to have the flush side of the cutter, actually I'm going to go a little farther back here because usually the first loop around isn't quite perfect. Okay, so the flush side of my cutter is turned towards my coil, the beveled side is towards my scrap. Okay. To cut the first ring, I'm going to flip the cutter around from how I had it. I'm going to go right past my first cut to that next part in the coil. Again, I have my flush side towards the part that I'm keeping, which is going to be my ring. And then we have our first ring. Okay. So to continue cutting down the coil, I first have to cut my end flush because the previous cut that I made left a pointed, bezeled end on this wire. So I'm just going to trim off 1 millimeter or 2 of wire, having the flush side of the cutter facing my coil, and the beveled side facing the piece of scrap that I'm going to throw away. Make sure you shield yourself when you make this cut, because this little piece of wire, if you have it pointed at your face, could fly into your face. So I'm just going to use my finger to hold it, or you could even just cup your hand over the cutter when you snip. And there's that little piece. Okay. Flip the cutter around. Cut the next ring. Time to trim again. Trim that little end off. Flip the cutter around. And cut the next ring. So you will end up with a pile of jump rings and a pile of little scraps. And usually the first and last ring of your coil are not quite usable. This one's not quite a full ring, so that's going to go in my garbage pile. Okay. Now I'd like to show you an alternate way to make your jump rings. It takes a little bit more control. I'm going to use my round nose plier. I'm able to make smaller jump rings on this than I am with the easy jump ring tool. Okay. I'm going to use a Sharpie marker to mark the spot on the plier that I'd like to form my rings, and that will help me to get a consistent sized coil. I'm just going to pick a spot here. Okay. And here's my 18 gauge wire again. So I'm going to grab the end of my wire at that spot that I marked on my plier, and I'll kind of rotate the tool or even wrap a little bit with my other hand to start to shape the wire against the plier. Now you'll notice once I've come around and the wire is starting to overlap itself that my original cut end is facing the end of the plier, and as I work, each time I shape the wire into the tool, I'm shaping it against the line that I marked, and my original cut end is slowly moving up towards the tip of the tool. Now you notice I'm making a relatively tight coil here. There's no gaps in between my rings. If you'd like, you can do your coil a little bit on the looser side like I did on the mandrel to leave a small gap in between your coils here. But I wanted to show you what you would do if you didn't leave yourself a gap. So you do have to be careful. If you leave too big of a gap, your rings might not be perfectly round. I'm going to stop there for now. Okay, bringing in my flush cutter. I'm going to cut my wire off. I'm not going to worry about getting it close to the coil yet. Just want to get my bundle out of the way. If you've made a tight coil like this one, before you can cut your rings, you're going to need to open it up a little bit so that you can fit your cutter in there. Now you're going to want to do this very carefully. I'm going to use 2 pliers, one on each side of my coil, just grasping the last ring. I'm going to give it a little tug. Whoop. So that's what you want to be careful about. It can be tough to move this wire. You just tug it from the other side. Okay. Just spreading it out just a little bit here. Alright, that's better than how it was. So now I'll have a little bit more room here to be able to fit my cutter into place. Just like cutting from the coil before, I'm going to begin with a trim and cut the end of my coil flush. Make sure you shield the little piece that's going to come off. Flip my cutter around, bring it right in past that first cut, and snip off the first ring. So then trim. Again, be very careful that you only get one thickness of the wire inside the cutter. That's why it's important to have a little bit of a space in between each ring. So there's my trim. Flip. Cut. And you go down the coil, cutting the rings one at a time.